There we go. I would actually like for us to think about starting a portrait of an artist in the next 3 weeks or so.
Good.
Okay, I heard one good. I saw Katrina smiling. All right, well, let's just set it up that way. In fact, why don't we start portrait of an artist a week after next? Assuming is anybody going
And
to
is that instead of Elizabeth Bone? Is that instead of Elizabeth Bone then?
Mm.
Are we going
Yeah,
to
I
a portrait of an artist and Dubliners? And
Well,
we've done
unless,
enough of
unless you want to do
Elizabeth
an Elizabeth Bowen story and then part of portrait of an artist, we can do that. That's a
Bone. No,
possibility.
I'm happy out. So we'll finish Elizabeth Bone next week.
Yeah, for the moment.
Thank you.
Okay, does everybody have a good
What-
chance of being around in a couple of weeks?
What is the date on that? I'm sorry, I don't have a calendar.
Well, that's going to be July.
July, I'm just curious. I have to have my husband bring my copy up from California.
Mhm.
So, and I think he'll be here by the end of June, but so that should be fine.
It would be, I think it's Monday the 3rd of July.
Okay, that's perfect. He'll be here by then.
Very good.
Okay. All right, Ann Meisner's here. All right. So Dubliners, a mother, right?
Mhm.
Mother. There we go. And let's get Ann Meisner here. Ann, are you here yet?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry
Okay,
I'm
well,
late.
That's okay. We're getting ready to start the Dubliner story, A Mother.
Uh-huh.
And the conversation that you missed is not next week, but the week after. We're going to begin Portrait of an Artist as a
Oh, good, good.
Portrait of an Artist as a young man. Okay.
And are you reading Bowen today?
We are reading Bowen today.
And which
we-
one?
We are reading A Love Story. which
Okay,
is on
thanks.
Page 497. Mhm.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. And we need Ann Doyle, would you please re-up the reading list? Because Ann Meisner can't see it until it's renewed. Okay. All right, I'm going to begin. So, chapter 13 in the Dubliners, A Mother.
Okay.
Mr. Holohan, Assistant Secretary of the Ayr Abu Society, had been walking up and down Dublin for nearly a month with his hands and pockets full of dirty pieces of paper, arranging about the series of concerts. He had a game laid, and for this, his friends called him Hoppy Holohan. He walked up and down constantly, stood by the hour at street corners, arguing the point and made notes. But in the end, it was Mrs. Kearney who arranged everything. Mrs. Devlin had become Mrs. Kearney out of spite. She had been educated in a high-class convent where she had learned French and music. As she was naturally pale and unbending in manner, she made few friends at school. When she came to the age of marriage, she was sent out to many houses where her plain and ivory manners were much admired. She sat amid the chilly circle of her accomplishments, waiting for some suitor to brave it and offer her a brilliant life. But the young men whom she met were ordinary, and she gave no encouragement, trying to console her romantic desires by eating a great deal of Turkish delight in secret. However, When she drew near the limit and her friends began to loosen their tongues about her, she silenced them by marrying Mr. Kearney, who was a bootmaker on Ormond Quay. Next, please.
He was much older than she. His conversation, which was serious, took place at intervals in his great brown beard. After the first year of married life, Mrs. Kearney perceived that such a man would wear better than a romantic person, but she never put her own romantic ideas away. He was sober, thrifty, and pious. He went to the altar every day, every first Friday, sometimes with her, oftener by himself. But she never weakened in her religion and was a good wife to him. At some party in a strange house, when she lifted her eyebrow ever so slightly, he stood up to take his leave. And when his cough troubled him, she put the eiderdown quilt over his feet and made a strong rum punch. For his part, he was a model father. By paying a small sum every week into a society he insured for both his daughters, a dowry of £100 each when they came to the age of 24. He sent the elder daughter, Kathleen, to a good convent where she learned French and music and afterwards paid her fees at the academy. Every year in the month of July, Mrs. Kearney found occasion to say to some friend, "My good man is packing us off to Scaries for a few weeks." Next, please.
If it was not Scaries, it was Howth or Greystones. When the Irish revival began to be appreciable, Mrs. Kearney determined to take advantage of her daughter's name and brought an Irish teacher to the house. Kathleen and her sisters sent Irish picture postcards to their friends, and these friends sent back other Irish picture postcards. On special Sundays, when Mr. Kearney went with his family to the Pro Cathedral, a little crowd of people would assemble after Mass at the corner of Cathedral Street. They were all friends of the Kearneys, musical friends or nationalist friends, and when they had played every little counter of gossip, they shook hands with one another all together, laughing at the crossing of so many hands, and said goodbye to one another in Irish. Soon the name of Miss Kathleen Kearney began to be heard often on people's lips. People said that she was very clever at music and a very nice girl, and moreover that she was a believer in the language movement. Mrs. Kearney was well and content at this. Therefore, she was not surprised when one day Mr. Holohan came to her and proposed that her daughter should be the accompanist at a series of 4 grand concerts, which his society was going to give in the Antient concert rooms. She brought him into the drawing room, made him sit down, and brought out the decanter and the silver biscuit barrel. She entered heart and soul into the details of the enterprise, advised and dissuaded, and finally a contract was drawn up by which Kathleen was to receive 8 guineas for her services as accompanist at the 4 grand concerts. Next, please.
As Mr. Holohan was a novice in such delicate matters as the wording of bills and the disposing of items for a programme, Mrs. Kearney helped him. She had tact. She knew what artistes should go into capitals and what artistes should go into small type. She knew that the first tenor would not like to come on after Mr. Meade's comic turn. To keep the audience continua diverted, she slipped the doubtful items in between the old favourites. Mr. Holohan called to see her every day to have her advice on some point. She was invariably friendly and advising, homely in fact. She pushed the decanter towards him, saying, "Now, help yourself, Mr. Holohan." And while he was helping himself, she said, don't be afraid of it." Everything went on smoothly. Mrs. Kearney brought some lovely blush pink charmeuse in brown Thomases to let into the front of Kathleen's dress. It cost a pretty penny, but there are occasions when a little expense is justifiable. She took a dozen of 2-shilling tickets for the final concert and sent them to those friends who could not be trusted to come otherwise. She forgot nothing, and thanks to her, everything that was to be done was done. Next, please.
The concerts were to be on Wednesday. Oh, sorry, the concerts. The concerts were to be on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. When Mrs. Kearney arrived with her daughter at the ancient concert rooms on Wednesday night, she did not like to look at things. A few young men wearing bright blue badges in their coats stood idle in the vestibule. None of them wore evening dress. She passed by with her daughter, and a quick glance through the open door of the hall showed her the cause of the steward's idleness. At first she wondered had she mistaken the hour. No, it was 20 minutes to 8. In the dressing room behind the stage, she was introduced to the secretary of the society, Mr. Fitzpatrick. She smiled and shook his hand. He was a little man with a white, vacant face. She noticed that he wore his soft brown hat carelessly on the side of his head, and his accent was flat. He held a programme in his hand, and while he was talking to her, he chewed one end of it into a moist pulp. He seemed to bear disappointments lightly. Mr. Houlihan came into the dressing room every few minutes with reports from the box office. The hostesses talked among themselves nervously, glanced from time to time at the mirror, and rolled and unrolled their music. When it was nearly 8:30, the few people in the hall began to express their desire to be entertained. Mr. Fitzpatrick came in, smiled vacantly at the room, and said, "Well now, ladies and gentlemen, I suppose we'd better open the ball." Next, please.
Mrs. Kearney rewarded his very flat final syllable with a quick stare of contempt, and then said to her daughter encouragingly, "Are you ready, dear?" When she had an opportunity, she called Mr. Houlihan aside and asked him to tell her what it meant. Mr. Houlihan did not know what it meant. He said that the committee had made a mistake in arranging for 4 concerts, 4 too many. "And the artistes," said Mrs. Kearney, "of course they are doing their best, but really they are no good." Mr. Houlihan admitted that the artistes were no good, but the committee, he said, had decided to let the first 3 concerts go as they pleased and reserve all the talent for Saturday night. Mrs. Kearney said nothing, but as the mediocre items followed one another on the platform and the few people in the hall grew fewer and fewer, she began to regret that she had put herself to any expense for such a concert. There was something she didn't like in the look of things, and Mr. Fitzpatrick's vacant smile irritated her very much. However, she said nothing and waited to see how it would end. The concert expired shortly before 10, and everyone went home quickly. Next.
The concert on Thursday night was better attended, but Mrs. Kearney saw at once that the house was filled with paper. The audience behaved indecorously, as if the concert were an informal dress rehearsal. Mr. Fitzpatrick seemed to enjoy himself. He was quite unconscious that Mrs. Kearney was taking angry note of his conduct. He stood at the edge of the screen from time to time, jutting out his head and exchanging a laugh with 2 friends in the corner of the balcony. In the course of the evening, Mrs. Kearney learned that the Friday concert was to be abandoned and that the committee was going to move heaven and earth to secure a bumper house on Saturday night. When she heard this, she sought out Mr. Houlihan. She buttonholed him as he was limping out quickly with a glass of lemonade for a young lady and asked him if it was true. Yes, it was true. Of course, that doesn't alter the contract, she said. The contract was for 4 concerts. Next, please.
Mr. Houlihan seemed to be in a hurry. He advised her to speak to Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mrs. Kearney was now beginning to be alarmed. She called Mr. Fitzpatrick away from his screen and told him that her daughter had signed for 4 concerts and that, of course, according to the terms of the contract, she should receive the sum originally stipulated for whether the society gave the 4 concerts or not. Mr. Fitzpatrick, who did not catch the point at issue very quickly, seemed unable to resolve the difficulty and said that he would bring the matter before the committee. Mrs. Kearney's anger began to flutter in her cheek. She had all she could do to keep from asking, "And who is the committee, pray?" But she knew that it would not be ladylike to do that, so she was silent. Next, please.
Little boys were sent out into the principal streets of Dublin early on Friday morning with bundles of handbills Special puffs appeared in all the evening papers, reminding the music-loving public of the treat which was in store for it on the following evening. Mrs. Kearney was somewhat reassured, but she thought well to tell her husband part of her suspicions. He listened carefully and said that perhaps it would be better if he went with her on Saturday night. She agreed. She respected her husband in the same way as she respected the General Post Office as something large, secure, and fixed. And though she knew the small number of his talents, she appreciated his abstract value as a male. She was glad that he had suggested coming with her. She thought her plans over. The night of the grand concert came. Mrs. Kearney with her husband and daughter arrived at the ancient concert rooms 3/4 of an hour before the time at which the concert was to begin. By ill luck, it was a rainy evening. Mrs. Kearney placed her daughter's clothes and music in charge of her husband and went all over the building looking for Mr. Holohan or Mr. Fitzpatrick. She could find neither. Next, please.
She asked the stewards was any member of the committee in the hall, and after a great deal of trouble, a steward brought out a little woman named Miss Byrne, to whom Miss Kearney explained that she wanted to see one of the secretaries. Miss Byrne expected them any minute and asked could she do anything. Mrs. Kearney looked searchingly at the oldish face, which was screwed into an expression of trustfulness and enthusiasm, and then answered, "No, thank you." The little woman hoped they would have a good house. She looked out at the rain and to the melancholy of the wet street, effaced all the trustfulness and enthusiasm from her twisted features. Then she gave a little sigh and said, "Oh, well, we did our best, the dear knows." Mrs. Kearney had to go back to the dressing room. The artistes were arriving. The bass and the second tenor had already come. The bass, Mr. Duggan, was a slender young man with a scattered black moustache. He was the son of the hall porter in an office in the city, and as a boy he had sung prolonged bass notes in the resounding hall. From this humble state he had raised himself until he had become a first-rate artiste. He had appeared in grand opera. One night when an operatic artiste had fallen ill, he had undertaken the part of the king in the opera of Maritana at the Queen's Theatre. He sang his music with great feeling and volume and was warmly welcomed by the gallery. But unfortunately, he marred the gut impression by wiping his nose in his gloved hand once or twice out of thoughtlessness. He was unassuming and spoke little. He said "yous" so softly that it passed unnoticed, and he never drank anything stronger than milk for his voice's sake. Mr. Bell, the second tenor, was a fair-haired little man who competed every year for prizes at the Feis Ceoil. On his fourth trial, he had been awarded a bronze medal. He was extremely nervous and extremely jealous of other tenors, and he covered his nervous jealousy with an ebullient friendliness. It was his humour to have people know what an ordeal a concert was to him. Therefore, when he saw Mr. Duggan, he went over to him and asked, "Are you in it too?" Next, please.
Yes, said
Yes,
Mr.
said-
Duggan. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Yes, said Mr. Duggan. Mr. Bell laughed, and his fellow sufferer held out his hand and said, "Shake." Mrs. Kearney passed by these two young men and went to the edge of the screen to view the house. The seats were being filled up rapidly, and a pleasant noise circulated in the auditorium. She came back and spoke to her husband privately. The conversation was evidently about Kathleen, for they both glanced at her often as she stood chatting to one of her nationalist friends, Miss Healy, the contralto. An unknown solitary woman with a pale face walked through the room. The woman followed with keen eyes the faded blue dress, which was stretched upon a meagre body. Someone said that she was Madame Glynn, the soprano. I wonder where did they dig her up, said Kathleen to Miss Healy. I'm sure I never heard of her. Miss Healy had to smile. Mr. Holohan limped into the dressing room at that moment, and the two young ladies asked him who was the unknown woman. Mr. Holohan said that she was Madame Glynn from London. Madame Glynn took her stand in the corner of the room, holding a roll of music stiffly before her, and from time to time changing the direction of her startled gaze. The shadow took her faded dress into shelter, but fell revengefully into the little cup behind her collarbone. The noise of the hall became more audible. The first tenor and the baritone arrived together. They were both well-dressed, stout and complacent, and they brought a breadth of opulence among the company. Next, please.
Mrs. Kearney brought her daughter over to them and talked to them amiably. She wanted to be on good terms with them, but while she strove to be polite, her eyes followed Mr. Holohan in his limping and devious courses. As soon as she could, she excused herself and went out after him. "Mr. Houlihan, I want to speak to you for a moment," she said. They went down to a discreet part of the corridor. Mrs. Kearney asked him when was her daughter going to be paid. Mr. Houlihan said that Mr. Fitzpatrick had charge of that. Mrs. Kearney said that she didn't know anything about a Mr. Fitzpatrick. Her daughter had signed a contract for 8 guineas, and she would have to be paid. Mr. Houlihan said that it wasn't his business. "Why isn't it your business?" asked Mrs. Kearney. "Didn't you yourself bring her the contract? Anyway, if it's not your business, it's my business, and I mean to see to it." "You better speak to Mr. Fitzpatrick," said Mr. Houlihan distantly. "I don't know anything about a Mr. Fitzpatrick," repeated Mrs. Kearney. "I have my contract, and I intend to see that it is carried out." When she came back to the dressing room, her cheeks were slightly suffused. The room was lively. 2 men in outdoor dress had taken possession of the fireplace and were chatting familiarly with Miss Healy and the baritone. They were from the Freeman man and Mr. O'Madden Burke. The Freeman man had come to say that he could not wait for the concert, as he had to report the lecture which an American priest was giving in the Mansion House. He said they were to leave the report for him at the Freeman office, and he would see that it went in. He was a gray-haired man with a plausible voice and careful manners. He held an extinguished cigar in his hand, and the aroma of cigar smoke floated near him. He had not intended to stay a moment because concerts and artistes bored him considerably, but he remained leaning against the mantelpiece. Next.
Miss Healy stood in front of him, talking and laughing. He was old enough to suspect one reason for her politeness, but young enough in spirit to turn the moment to account. The warmth, fragrance, and color of her body appealed to his senses. He was pleasantly conscious that the bosom which he saw rise and fall slowly beneath him rose and fell at that moment for him, that the laughter and fragrance and willing glances were his tribute. When he could stay no longer, he took leave of her regretfully. O'Madden Burke will write the notice," he explained to Mr. Holohan, "and I will see it in." "Thank you very much, Mr. Hendrick," said Mr. Holohan. "You'll see it in, I know. Now, won't you have a little something before you go?" "I don't mind," said Mr. Hendrick. The 2 men went along some tortuous passages and up a dark staircase and came to a secluded room where one of the stewards was uncorking bottles for a few gentlemen. One of these gentlemen was Mr. O'Madden Burke, who had found out the room by instinct. He was a suave, elderly man who balanced his imposing body when at rest upon a large silk umbrella. His magniloquent Western name was the moral umbrella upon which he balanced the fine problem of his finances. He was widely respected. Next, please.
While Mr. Holohan was entertaining the Freeman man, Mrs. Kennedy was speaking so animatedly to her husband that he had to ask her to lower her voice. The conversation of the others in the dressing room had become strained. Mr. Bell, the first item, stood ready with his music, but the accompanist made no sign. Evidently, something was wrong. Mr. Kearney looked straight before him, stroking his beard, while Mrs. Kearney spoke into Kathleen's ear with subdued emphasis. From the hall came sounds of encouragement, clapping and stamping of feet. The first tenor and the baritone and Miss Healy stood together, waiting tranquilly, but Mr. Bell's nerves were greatly agitated because he was afraid the audience would think that he had come late. Next, please.
Mr. Holohan and Mr. O'Madden Burke came into the room. In a moment, Mr. Holohan perceived the hush. He went over to Mrs. Kearney and spoke with her earnestly. While they were speaking, the noise in the hall grew louder. Mr. Holohan became very red and excited. He spoke volubly, but Mrs. Kearney said curtly at intervals, "She won't go on. She must get her 8 guineas." Mr. Holohan pointed desperately towards the hall where the audience was clapping and stamping. He appealed to Mr. Kearney and to Kathleen, but Mr. Kearney continued to stroke his beard, and Kathleen looked down, moving the point of her new shoe. It was not her fault. Mrs. Kearney repeated, "She won't go on without her money." After a swift struggle of tongues, Mr. Holohan hobbled out in haste. The room was silent. When the strain of the silence had become somewhat painful, Miss Healy said to the baritone, "Have you seen Mrs. Pat Campbell this week?" The baritone had not seen her, but he had been told that she was very fine. The conversation went no further. The first tenor bent his head and began to count the links of the gold chain, which was extended across his waist, smiling and humming random notes to observe the effect on the frontal sinus. From time to time, everyone glanced at Mrs. Kearney. The noise in the auditorium had risen to a clamor when Mr. Fitzpatrick burst into the room, followed by Mr. Holohan, who was panting. The clapping and stamping in the hall were punctuated by whistling. Mr. Fitzpatrick held a few banknotes in his hand. He counted out 4 into Mrs. Kearney's hand and said she would get the other half at the interval. Mrs. Kearney said, "But this is 4 shillings short." Next, please.
But Kathleen gathered in her skirt and said, "Now, Mr. Bell," to the first item, who was shaking like an aspen. The singer and the accompanist went out together. The noise in the hall died away. There was a pause of a few seconds, and then the piano was heard. The first part of the concert was very successful, except for Madam Glynn's item. The poor lady sang Killarney in a bodiless, gasping voice, with all the old-fashioned mannerisms of intonation and pronunciation which she believed lent elegance to her singing. She looked as if she had been resurrected from an old stage wardrobe, and the cheaper parts of the hall made fun of her high, wailing notes. The first tenor and the contralto, however, brought down the house. Kathleen played a selection of Irish airs, which was generously applauded. The first part closed with a stirring patriotic recitation delivered by a young lady who arranged amateur theatricals. It was deservedly applauded, and when it was ended, the men went out for the interval content. All this time, the dressing room was a hive of excitement. In one corner were Mr. Holohan, Mr. Fitzpatrick, Miss Byrne, 2 of the stewards, the baritone, the bass, and Mr. O'Madden Burke. Mr. O'Madden Burke said it was the most scandalous exhibition he had ever witnessed. Miss Kathleen Kearney's musical career was ended in Dublin after that, he said. The baritone was asked what did he think of Mrs. Kearney's conduct. He did not like to say anything. He had been paid his money and wished to be at peace with men. However, he said that Mrs. Kearney might have taken the artistes into consideration. The stewards and the secretaries debated hotly as to what should be done when the interval came. Next, please.
"I agree with Miss Burney," said Mr. O'Madden Burke. "Pay her nothing." In another corner of the room were Mrs. Kearney and her husband, Mr. Bell, Miss Healy, and the young lady who had to recite the patriotic piece. Mrs. Kearney said that the committee had treated her scandalously. She had spared neither trouble nor expense, and this was how she was repaid. They thought they had only a girl to deal with, and that, therefore, they could ride roughshod over her, but she would show them their mistake. They wouldn't have dared to treat her like that if she had been a man, but she would see that her daughter got her rights. She wouldn't be fooled. If they didn't pay her to the last farthing, she would make Dublin ring. Of course, she was sorry for the sake of the artists, but what else could she do? She appealed to the second tenor, who said he thought she had not been well treated. Then she appealed to Miss Healy. Miss Healy wanted to join the other group, but she did not like to do so, because she was a great friend of Kathleen's, and the Kearneys had often invited her to their house. As soon as the first part was ended, Mr. Fitzpatrick and Mr. Holohan went over to Mrs. Kearney and told her that the other 4 guineas would be paid after the committee meeting on the following Tuesday, and that in case her daughter did not play for the second part, the committee would consider the contract broken and would pay nothing. Next, please.
"I haven't seen any committee," said Mrs. Kearney angrily. "My daughter has her contract. She will get 4 pounds 8 into her hand, or a foot she won't put on that platform. I'm surprised at you, Mrs. Kearney, said Mr. Houlihan. I never thought you would treat us this way. And what way did you treat me? Asked Mrs. Kearney. Her face was inundated with an angry color, and she looked as if she would attack someone with her hands. I'm asking for my rights, she said. You might have some sense of decency, said Mr. Houlihan. Might I indeed? And when I ask when my daughter is going to get paid, I can't get a civil answer. She tossed her head and assumed a haughty voice. You must speak to the secretary. It's not my business. I'm a great fellow, fall-de-diddly-do. I thought you were a lady, said Mr. Houlihan, walking away from her abruptly. After that, Mrs. Kearney's conduct was condemned on all hands. Everyone approved of what the committee had done. She stood at the door, haggard with rage, arguing with her husband and daughter, gesticulating with them. She waited until it was time for the second part to begin in the hope that the secretaries would approach her. But Miss Healy had kindly consented to play 1 or 2 accompaniments. Mrs. Kearney had to stand aside to allow the baritone and his accompanist to pass up to the platform. She stood still for an instant like an angry stone image, and when the first notes of the song struck her ear, she caught up her daughter's cloak and said to her husband, "Get a cab." Next.
He went out at once. Mrs. Kearney wrapped the cloak around her daughter and followed him. As she passed through the doorway, she stopped and glared into Mr. Houlihan's face. I'm not done with you yet, she said. But I'm done with you, said Mr. Houlihan. Kathleen followed her mother meekly. Mr. Houlihan began to pace up and down the room in order to cool himself, for his skin on fire. That's a nice lady, he said. Oh, she's a nice lady. You did the proper thing, Houlihan, said Mr. O'Madden Burke, poised under his umbrella in approval. Great story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great story. Wow.
I have a note that the daughter is in the last chapter of Ulysses. As some of the characters Dubliners are. Yeah.
Huh.
She's in the Penelope section. She's mentioned.
The last chapter.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
Huh.
Yeah. Well, of course, O'Madden Burke, is definitely
She's called Miss Kearney.
Oh,
Kearney.
that's interesting.
Can't remember now.
Yeah, because Molly might have known her then.
Yeah, I remember there's something in Penelope where Molly is talking about the Antioch.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Well.
So who was right?
Oh no, they were obviously
Trying to get her for nothing. Yeah.
Yeah.
well, they weren't even that thoughtful. I mean, they weren't trying to get her for nothing. It was just going to work out that way. They just assumed,
Yeah.
just like they did all the assumptions again about how they changed the schedule of everything, blah, blah, blah.
I have a note in my copy of the first from the first sentence, the name of the society, Air Abu. It's Ireland to victory.
Okay, so it was a nationalist group.
Well, it's also like Joyce would do. It's like we ask which side was right, but then that's the problem with their victory. It's convoluted with righteousness on both sides and not settled.
Well, I mean, I don't know. At least in my experience, I feel like I've been in similar situations.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
you know, where some people think that they're totally in charge of everything, and that if you don't agree with them, it's because you're being unreasonable.
Mhm.
So
It's on you. Mm.
yeah, so I mean, Mrs. Kearney was actually right, in my opinion. But the problem was in that situation, what does right get you?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glancing at this article in Tyndall, and as what I had not reading it thoroughly, but it kind of seems to intimate that the mother was just horrible. And they talk about saying also that Dublin suffers from a cultural as well as a political paralysis.
So Tyndall is viewing her as horrible. I mean, she's tough and weird. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah,
But,
he says she's terrible. Which
what's
I didn't agree with that.
yeah, I don't agree with that either. I don't know what he's talking about. I
Yeah.
mean, she is a little clueless. I mean, if she had been super aware, she'd really never gotten her daughter involved in the first place. Or she
Mhm.
would have worked it out differently, you know, maybe gotten her daughter a much more minor situation. Maybe just as the accompanist for one artist and that's it. And you know, agreed on that. But you know, I mean, she's tough, and I'm sure Kathleen was mortified,
Yeah.
and actually her husband was mortified also, but he was obviously of the type that said, "Well, you know, this is my wife,
I liked that one
so I
phrase that
sleep with, so I
Yeah.
take it." Huh?
I like the one phrase where it says he spoke through his beard.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, that was funny, wasn't it? Yeah, yeah. Open his beard.
Yeah, you could just see the fullness of the beard and the little hole of the mouth that was.
I could just see it. Mhm. Yeah.
Oh dear. And the other thing is like there's this overtone of having been spent, I'll put it. Like when before she gets married, it's described as being almost a spinster. She would, and the term is she drew near the limit.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I was just going to say, I love the bit about her trying to console her romantic desires by eating a great deal of Turkish delight in secret.
Yes.
I love Cadbury's Turkish, the Turkish bar. Well, there's two different types of Cadbury's do, but a lot of people think it's too sweet. But that's actually my bar of chocolate, and so I think, I'll be thinking, goodness, I look like a spinster now if I eat this.
Aw.
There are worse ways of handling a problem.
And then, well, the other thing is, she became Mrs. Kearney out of spite.
Hmm.
Yes.
What was that? She married just because the people were talking about her or pushing her into spinsterhood.
Mhm.
That term, out of spite. Mm.
Yeah, it would imply she didn't want to marry the man,
Yeah, and she's.
but you know, was feeling the pressure.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Is there a little bit of a social difference as well? Like she went to a high class convent and then the daughter went to a good convent. So not the same convent.
Mm.
Like he was a good
Okay.
provider, but maybe not quite as good as what she received. I don't know. They did the
Mhm.
same. They did the same subjects, so French and music, didn't they?
Mhm.
And there was a second daughter, but we don't know anything about her. Where she was all this time. I found the mother to be very pushy.
Oh,
I didn't-
well,
yeah, I
yes,
didn't like
yes,
her.
of
Yeah.
course, of course. And like I say, I mean, the problem was her mistake was getting so involved in it, of not really realizing of how things would work,
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
you
Mm.
know, because they not only got they not only got the daughter, or thought they were going to get the daughter, but the mother seems like she did the bulk of the organizing and the prep work.
Well, she did everything.
Yeah, because she was trying to promote her daughter,
Mhm.
and then
Yeah.
so this was not when they were not forthcoming with the money. Well, when they were not forthcoming with the schedule, and then they weren't forthcoming with the money. No, she was angry.
Yeah. I would be angry too.
Yep. But she's also dealing with her own failings because she
Yeah.
was offered as a pianist and an accompanist and with the intention that some suitor would find her so accomplished that there would be, a proposal. So she's trying to compensate in a sense for her own loss and diminished expectations for herself, but trying to put the daughter into a position that would be successful.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, I remembered that story.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And what about his being a bootmaker? I mean, you can just, you could hear the taunts of booted out of the concert or
Yeah.
getting the boot.
Well,
Yeah, he might have been making them, but his wife was wearing them. She was in charge.
And I love the line that she respected him like one would respect the GPO.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The general post office, something large, secure, and fixed. Which
Yeah.
is actually
It's great.
So it's good.
Yeah.
It is actually 7 minutes before 2. How long is the
oh, what did I say? About 15 pages?
yeah, that's gonna be too long.
That's too long. Should we pick a shorter one?
If we can
You
find
find
a
it-
short one, that would probably be the best thing to do.
Okay, let me look here.
And while you can let me push forth
How
and
about the last night in the old home? It's 4 pages.
oh, sounds good. What page is
We
that
read
on?
that. We have read that. You know that.
Oh, we read that. Oh, okay. Oh, we
Back
did.
in May.
Well, how
did.
about the Tommy Crayons? That is 6 pages. Or the
Okay.
cat jumps. That is 7 pages.
What was the one you said, the Tommy something?
The Tommy
Oh,
Crayon.
Tommy. I can see it. Yeah.
349. 349.
Yeah. 7 pages.
49. Okay, Elizabeth, we're putting you to the test here. Because that was a really good choice story.
Yeah.
I do want to bring up one thing so you can maybe think a little bit about it. I looked up and 2 weeks from now is July 3rd.
That's
Or
right.
July.
Like a holiday.
Yeah, there's gonna be the holiday thing. I think that probably we want to start portrait the week after that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because holidays, I mean, I suspect, no more than 2/3 of us are gonna show up.
Yeah. It's a busy time.
And who knows what. Yeah. Okay, the Tommy Crayons. Who was the final reader on a mother?
I don't remember.
Wasn't it you?
Was it me? Okay, if it was me, then that means Susan.
No,
Take it
me.
away, Susan.
No, it's me.
no, yeah.
It's me.
Okay. Go.
Katrina, then me.
Herbert's feet, from dangling so long in the train, had died of cold in his boots. He stamped a couple of coffins on blue and buff mosaic. In the Tommy Cran's cloakroom, the pegs were too high. Uncle Arthur cocked HMS. Terrible for him over a checked ulster. Tommy Cran, aslant meanwhile in the doorway, was an enormous presence. Come on now, come, he exclaimed, and roared with impatience. You would have said he was also arriving at the Tommy Cran's Christmas party, of which Wynne could not bear to miss a moment. Next, please.
Now into the hall, Mrs. Tommy Cran came swimming from elsewhere, dividing with curved little strokes the festive air, hyacinths and gunpowder. Her sleeves and 1,000 ruffles fled from her elbows. She gained Uncle Archer's lapels and bobbing floated from this attachment. Uncle Archer, verifying the mistletoe, loudly kissed her face of a delicate pink sugar. Ha! Yelled Tommy, drawing an unseen dagger. Herbert laughed with embarrassment. Only think Nancy let off all the crackers before tea. She's quite wild, but there are more behind the piano. Is this little Herbert? Herbert. Very well, thank you, said Herbert, and shook hands defensively. It was his first Christmas day without any father. The news went before him. He had seen his mother off, very brave with a holly wreath in the cemetery tram. She and father were spending Christmas afternoon together. Next, please.
Mrs. Tommy Cran stooped to him, bright with a tear glitter, then with a strong upward sweep like an angel's, bore him to gaiety. Fancy Nancy. He fancied Nancy, so by now they would all be wearing the paper caps. Flinging back a white door, she raced Herbert elsewhere. The room where they all sat seemed to be made of glass. It collected the whole daylight. The candles were still waiting. Over the garden, day still hung like a pink flag, over the trees like frozen feathers, the enchanted icy lake, the lawn. The table was in the window. As Herbert was brought in, a clock struck 4. The laughing heads all turned in a silence brief as a breath's intake. The great many gentlemen and the rejoicing ladies leaned apart. He and Nancy looked at each other gravely. He saw Nancy, crowned and serious because she was a queen. Advanced by some urgent pushing, he made his way round the table and sat down beside her podgily. Next, please.
She said, how do you do? Did you see our lake? It is all frozen. Did you ever see our lake before? I never came here. Did you see our 2 swans? She was so beautiful, rolling her ringlets round with light on her lacy shoulders. Then he said rather shortly, I shouldn't have thought your lake was large enough for 2 swans. It is indeed, said Nancy. It goes round the island. It's large enough for a boat. They were waiting around the Christmas cake for tea to be brought in. Mrs. Tommy Cran shook out the ribbons of her guitar and began to sing again. Very quietly for a secret, he and Nancy crept to the window. She showed how the lake wound. He could guess how in summer her boat would go pushing around the lily leaves. She showed him their boathouse, rusty red from a lamp inside, solid. We had a lamp put there for the poor cold swans, and the swans were asleep beside it. How old are you, Herbert? 8. Oh, I'm 9. Do you play brigands? I could, said Herbert. Oh, I don't. I hate to, but I know some boys who do. Did you have many presents? Uncle Ponto brought me a train. It's more suitable for a boy, really. I could give it to you, perhaps. How many uncles? Began Herbert. 10 pretense and none really. I'm adopted because Mommy and Daddy have no children. I think that's better fun, don't you? Yes, replied Herbert after consideration. Anybody could be born. Next, please.
All the time, Nancy had not ceased to look at him seriously and impersonally. They were both tired already by this afternoon of boisterous grown-up society. They would have liked to be quiet, and though she was loved by 10 magic uncles and wore a pearl locket, and he was fat with spectacles and felt deformed a little from everybody's knowing about his father, they felt at ease in each other's company. Nancy, cut the cake, exclaimed Mrs. Tommy, and they all clapped their hands for Nancy's attention. So the colored candles were lit. The garden went dark with loneliness and was immediately curtained out. Two of the uncles put rugs on and bounded about the room like bears and lions. The other faces drew out a crimson band around the silver teapot. Mrs. Tommy could not bear to put down the guitar, so the teapot fell into the hands of a fuzzy lady with several husbands who cried, "Ah, don't now," and had to keep brushing gentlemen's hands from her waist. And all the others leaned on each other's shoulders and laughed with gladness because they had been asked to the Tommy Crans. A dozen times, everyone died of laughter and rose again, redder ghosts. Teacups whizzed down a chain of hands. Now Nancy, standing up very straight to cut the cake, was like a doll stitched upright into its box, apt if you should cut the string at the back to catch right forward and break its delicate fingers. Next.
Oh dear, she sighed as the knife skidded over the icing, but nobody heard but Herbert. For someone, seeing her white frock over the palace of cake, proposed the health of the bride, and Uncle Joseph, tipping the tea about in his cup, stared and stared with juicy eyes, but nobody saw Herbert. After tea, she whispered, we'll go and stand on the lake. And after tea they did, while the others played hide and seek. Herbert, once looking back through a window, saw uncles chasing the laughing ants. It was not cold on the lake. Nancy said, I have never believed in fairies. Did you either? She told him she had been given a white muff and was going to be an organist with an organ of her own. She was going up to Belfast the next month to dance for charity. She said she would not give him the train after all. She would give him something really her own, a pink glass greyhound that was an ornament. When Uncle Archer and Herbert left to walk to the tram terminus, the party was at its brightest. They were singing Hark the Herald round the drawing room piano. Nancy sat on her Uncle Joseph's knees, more than politely. Next, please.
Uncle Archer did not want to go home either. That was a nice little girl, he said, huh? Herbert nodded. His uncle, glad that the little chap hadn't had, after all, such a dismal Christmas, pursued heartily, Kiss her? Herbert looked quite blank. To tell the truth, this had never occurred to him. He kissed Nancy later. His death, even, was indirectly caused by his loss of her. But their interchanges were never passionate, and he never knew her better than when they had been standing out in the lake, beyond the cheerful windows. Herbert's mother did not know Uncle Archer's merry friends. She had always loved to live quietly, and as her need for comfort increased, she and Herbert saw less, or at least as little as ever, of Uncle Archer. So that for years, Herbert was not taken again across Dublin to the house with the lake. Once he saw Nancy carry her white muff into a shop, but he stood rooted and did not run after her. Once he saw Mrs. Tommy Cran out in Stephen's Green throwing lollipops to the ducks, but he did not approach. There was nothing to say. He was sent to school where he painfully learned to be natural with boys. His sight got no better. They said he must wear glasses all his life. Years later, however, when Herbert was 13, the Crans gave a dancing party and did not forget him. He danced once with Nancy. She was silenter now, but she said, Why did you never come back again? He could not explain. He trod on her toes and danced heavily on. A Chinese lantern blazed up, and in the confusion he lost her. That evening he saw Mrs. Tommy in tears in the conservatory. Nancy clung, pressing her head with its drooping pink ribbons to Mrs. Cran's shoulder, pressing perhaps the shoulder against the head. Soon it was all right again, and Mrs. Tommy led off in Sir Roger, but Nancy was like a ghost who presently vanished. A week afterwards he had a letter. Next, please.
Please meet me to the tea at Mitchell's. I want your advice specially. She was distracted. She had come into Dublin to sell her gold wristwatch. Tommy Crans had lost all their money. It wasn't fair to expect them to keep it. They were generous and gay. Nancy had to think hard what must they'd all do. Herbert went round with her from jeweller to jeweller. These all laughed and paid her nothing but compliments. Her face, with those delicate, lovely eyebrows, grew tragic under the fur cap. It rained continuously. She and Herbert looked with incredulity into the grown-up faces. They wondered how one could penetrate far into life without despair. At last, the man on the keys gave her 8 and 6 for the watch. Herbert, meanwhile, had spent 8 shillings of his pocket money on their cab. And even so, her darling feet were sodden. They were surprised to see from the window Tommy Cran jump from an outside car and run joyfully into the Shelburne. It turned out he had raised some more money from somewhere, as he deserved. So he sold the house with the lake and moved to an ornamental castle by Dublin Bay. In spite of the grey sea, the transreal light from the sea, the terrace here was grey, and with urns of geraniums magnificent with a descent of steps, scrolls and whirls of balustrade, all the grandeur of Strucken. Here the band played for their afternoon parties, and here, when they were 20 and 21, Herbert asked Nancy to marry him. A pug harassed with bells rang jingly about the terrace. Oh, I don't know, Herbert, I don't know. Do you think you don't love me? Next, please.
Anne, are you reading?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know whom I love. Everyone would have to be different. Herbert, I don't see how we are ever to live. We seem to know everything. Surely there should be something for us we don't know. She shut her eyes. They kissed seriously and searchingly. In his arms, her body felt soft and voluminous. He could not touch her because of the great fur coat. The coat had been a surprise from Tommy Cran, who loved to give presents on delightful occasions, for now they were off to the Riviera. They were sailing in 4 days. Nancy and Mrs. Tommy had still all their shopping to do, all his money to spend. He loved them both to be elegant. There was that last party to give before leaving home. Mrs. Tommy could hardly leave the telephone. Crossing London, they were to give yet another party at Euston Hotel. And how could I leave them, she asked. They're my business, because they are not quite your parents? Oh, no, she said, eyes reproachful for the misunderstanding he had put up. She knew only from bitterness. They would be my affair, whoever it was. Don't you see? They're like that. Next.
Tommy Cran's returned from the Riviera subdued and gave no more parties than they could avoid. They hung sun-yellow curtains in the imitation of the Mede, and all the castle windows, and fortified themselves against despair. They warned their friends they were ruined. They honestly were. And there were heartfelt evenings of consolation. After such evenings, Mrs. Tommy, awakening heavily, whimpered in Nancy's arms, and Tommy approached silence. Had the highest opinion of Nancy and were restored by her confidence. She knew they'd be all right. She assured them they were the best, the happiest people. They were popular. Look how life had come back again and again to beg their pardon. And just to show them, she accepted Jeremy Neath and his thousands. So the world could see she was lucky. The world saw the Tommy Crans and their daughter had all the luck. To Herbert, she explained nothing. She expected everything of him on behalf of the Tommy Crans. Next.
The two Crans were distracted by her hypothesis from the incident of their ruin. They had seen her queen of a perpetual Christmas party for 6 months before they themselves came down magnificently like an empire. Then Nancy came to fetch them over to England, where her husband had found a small appointment for Tommy, excuse for a pension. But Tommy would not want that long. He had a scheme already, a stunner, a certainty. You just wrote to a whole 100 people and put in half a crown. That last night he ran about with the leaflets up and down the uncarpeted castle stairs that were his no longer. He offered to let Herbert in on it. He would yet see Herbert a rich man. Herbert and Nancy walked after dark on the terrace. She looked ill, tired. She was going to have a baby. When I asked you to marry me, he said, you never answered. You've never answered yet. Next, please.
She said there was no answer. We could never have loved each other, and we shall always love each other. We are related. Herbert, a heavy, young man, walked past desperation beside her. He did not want peace, but a sword. He returned again and again to the unique moment of her strangeness to him. As a child, she had spoken. Before, bewildered by all the laughter, he had realized she also was silent. Excuse me. You never played games, he said, or believed in fairies or anything. I'd have played any game your way. I'd have been good at them. You let them pull all the crackers before tea. Now I'd have loved those crackers. That day we met at Mitchell's to sell your watch, you wouldn't have sugar cakes, though I wanted to comfort you. You never asked me out to go around the island in your boat. I'd have died to do that. I never even saw your swans awake. You hold back everything from me and expect me to understand. Why should I understand? In the name of God, what game are we playing? Next, please.
But you do understand. Oh God, he cried in revulsion, I don't want to. And now you're going to have a stranger child. Her sad voice in the dark said, you said then anybody could be born. Herbert, you and I have nothing to do with children. This must be a child like them. As I turned back to face the window, her smile and voice were tender, but not for him. In the brightly lit, stripped room, the Tommy Crans walked about together, like lovers in their freedom from one another. They talked of the fortune to be made, the child to be born. Tommy flung his chest out and moved his arms freely in air he did not possess. Here and there, pink leaflets fluttered into the dark. The Tommy Crans would go on forever and be continued. Their seed should never fail.
Ooh, another good story.
Whoa.
What a strange story.
And strange. Well, she's strange. The two children were more grown up than the Crans.
Mm-hmm.
Money talks.
Yeah, well, she did what she had to do.
I thought there might be some tragedy with them falling through the ice at the lake.
Yeah.
I guess my mind kept going off in different directions. Like,
No, don't go there.
where was it leading? You know, what was the next tragedy?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Well, they were self-made tragedies. The Crans.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, but there was never there was always a temporary tragedy for them. I mean, I
Well,
think
somebody always pulled them out of it. Yeah.
well, at times it was Nancy.
Yeah.
I mean,
And
Nancy was living her life through the Tommy Crans,
yeah.
that they were so full of emotion about everything that she was overwhelmed by them. And just
Well, they were just such happy-go-lucky people.
Mhm.
And they loved people, they loved entertaining, they loved spending money, and they didn't think about any consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But poor Herbert. He did understand.
Well, he was also a victim of the Tommy Crans.
He was the victim. Yeah. Yeah.
What an odd story.
Mhm.
I'd have to read it again.
Mm-hmm.
I liked it, but it made me so sad.
Mhm.
Why did it make you so sad?
Because, well, Herbert particularly was a victim of their behavior, and so was Nancy. Although she
Yeah.
didn't need to be, she did that on her own.
Well, and Herbert did his on his own also.
Really, you think so? How?
Well, I mean, he could have just said, well, this isn't working. I gotta do something else.
Oh, you mean he could have left her?
Yeah. Yeah, he could have
Yeah, but
just,
he loved
I
her
mean-
since they were children.
Hmm?
He loved her since they were children.
He loved her since they were children, but I mean, you know, was she the same her?
I think so.
Yeah.
What is what has happened in the second paragraph with the mother going off to the cemetery with the wreath? Has the father has died?
Think so. I think so. He mentions this was his first Christmas without a father.
Uh-huh. And the
We
mother
talking-
goes off in the coach. He had seen his mother off very brave with the holly wreath in the
Yeah.
cemetery tram.
Yeah.
What page are we on?
The first one,
First page.
the third paragraph or fourth paragraph.
Okay. She and father were spent the afternoon.
Okay. So okay. Got it.
Those first paragraphs were written very strangely. They were hard to they're hard to understand.
Yeah. To follow.
Yeah. To follow. Yeah.
Well, it took me a number of pages to realize that Nancy was a child.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I wasn't, I guess I was busy doing other things, but I didn't realize that Nancy was a separate being from Mrs. Tommy Crans.
Oh.
Yeah, in those first pages, it's hard also to think of Herbert was a child. They were. It was confusing. Maybe that's on purpose. Maybe because they acted like adults, like the parents didn't.
Yeah, well, now that it's pointed out that this was the first Christmas without his father, I mean, it seems like a lot of Herbert's psychology was based upon his mother's grief. Because the mother, later in the story, it implies that the mother basically retreated and became a hermit, and he went to be a hermit with her because, it was just him and his mother. As opposed to Nancy, who's hanging out with the Tommy Crans, who are always up to all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
The story seems kind of personal.
Yeah.
To Elizabeth Bowen.
I have to read her book about the house. Her not novel, I think someone here read it, didn't they? What's the name of the book? I have it.
Yeah, I didn't read that.
I have it somewhere.
Okay, shall we try something a little different today? Shall we select next week's stories?
We can do that.
We could do that. Could do that.
Exactly.
And how about if I suggest we were gonna go back? What were the two Dubliner stories that we were sure that we wanted to read again? One
Oh,
was-
yes.
One was the counter story.
Yeah, the counterparts, yeah.
What was the story that we read of Elizabeth Bowen's that I said took place at, they called it something stone. And I said it was, as they described it, I said that was Folkestone. And I did find the pictures of them.
Oh, this was the war, during the war years story.
I don't remember. I'm too old. I don't remember anything at all.
No, come on, John. Come on, John.
Was it Ivy gripped the steps, Joan?
Maybe, let me look and see. What page was that? Let me find
Because
it.
that's a wartime one.
That's nostalgia looking back at the properties.
The Warriors.
No.
686.
750.
Yeah, I propose that next week we reread, let's see, Counterparts.
Yep.
Put down Counterparts. And then somebody else decide which Elizabeth Bowen story.
Yes, Southston, that was. Ivy gripped the steps.
Did you want to read that one again, Joan?
No, I just wanted to show you the pictures of Folkestone.
Oh, Southstone,
Oh, okay.
Okay, so we have to
If I-
find them from.
I have to find them a minute. I had them and then because remember they talked about how the beach was so full of people and I told you it was empty. Yeah. Yeah, I have a picture.
So Counterparts is 14 pages, so we'll have to do with a short one, so don't we? A short Elizabeth Bowen.
Mhm.
The post-war story, Hand in Glove, sounds like a counterpart.
Which one, sorry?
It's called Hand in Glove. It's a post-war story.
Okay, Hand in Glove. And what page is it on?
767.
Yeah, it's 10 pages. Perfect.
Okay, good.
So here, let's see if you can see this. I don't know.
Perfect.
Okay, you're gonna have to
Oh, yeah.
hold it up a little straighter. Because right now there's some glare.
Mhm,
Oh, yeah,
that's-
okay.
That's one. And see if
That's quite a large beach.
oh, it's a very large beach. And it has and then there are those houses they talked about that overlook the water.
Mhm.
And I think that was, everything's falling out of this. I think, let's see. Is that it?
No, that's the boats, the
That's
lower.
Those are boats.
Go to the lower one.
No, it's up further up. It's on top. It should be.
Oh, meaning it's the top of the picture.
Oh, wait, it is lower. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Perfect.
That's
You
a
can't
big
see
building.
that.
It's like a,
It's more than one. I think they're separated. I think they're those homes that they spoke of overlooking the water.
Huh, okay.
She wrote a book. I forget which book it was, and I was reading it. And in it, the couple was walking along this ridge, and I thought, oh, there's Folkestone. So I think that she might have used that location,
Oh,
Mhm.
more than once.
That's the story where the housekeeper and the housekeeper would take the boy down to the beach.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
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 Ivy and the
It's,
steps.
it's near Dover. It's right along that area there.
So that's another boy who's kind of isolated.
Mhm.
That boy was kind of a little bit like Herbert in the
I
story you read
can't
today.
remember.
Well, it was like he would go visit his aunt in the summers.
Yeah, it was his mother's friend.
It was his mother's friend. Okay.
Yeah.
And his
And he
mother,
was small but ill.
right. And his mother's friend actually had an affair with the admiral.
Mm.
I think I got the right story there.
Yeah. I think so.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right.
Well, that's it. So next week we have counterparts in hand in glove.
Yeah.
It's probably a good idea to read them first.
Mhm. Yeah, that'd be a good idea.
Tell me again what they are, because I was so busy talking.
Yeah.
Like counterparts.
Okay.
Oh, counterparts, yeah.
And we were like three of us read that, I think.
And what's the other one?
Hand in glove.
Hand in glove.
Hand and glove?
Mhm. It's a post-war story.
Okay.
Okay.
Harvey, there's
Okay.
the cat. Harvey, there's no cat.
Oh, did you hear my
Is
cat?
that
Harvey did. He just
oh,
tried.
Harvey the dog is going, what, where?
He's looking in the garden.
He heard the cat.
Harvey, come here.
He gets some canned food at 3:00, and at about 2:45, he starts pacing the floor and
All right.
That's
So,
funny.
does anybody have anything else they want to say about the Herbert and Nancy story?
Well,
Tell me
I was just thinking that Herbert he was described as overweight and glasses, and he's
Mhm.
almost like a mama's boy in a sense, and you could see where he would latch on to someone who could spend time with him and make him laugh, and that makes the relationship really special, and it is poignant that it didn't go forward.
Mhm. Yeah, I can see that part.
Yeah,
Because it does sound like his mother became more reclusive,
yeah, yeah.
and he was kind of raised in shall we say, a gloomy atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And I'm sure that the Tommy Glands and Nancy seem rather glamorous.
Yeah. Joyous. Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Okay, well, good reading, good choices. Thank you
Yes,
so
they
much.
are. It's hard to miss with Joyce, and
Yeah, this is a good match.
yeah,
I'll see you
Okay.
next week.
next
Okay.
week.
Okay.
Thank
See you
you.
next
See you
week.
next
Bye,
week.
everybody.